A year before this, Paul Skeens was still in college, carving up hitters at LSU and hanging out with everyone's favorite social media gymnast. After racking up a ton of accolades in college, he went #1 overall in the MLB draft to the Pittsburgh Pirates, having Ken Griffey Jr. announce his name at the podium. A year later, he's become arguably the best pitcher in the National League. And with him and 2022 first overall pick Jackson Holliday both getting Major League action this year, every single #1 pick in MLB history has eventually made the big leagues. Except for 3. There have been 59 MLB drafts so far. 56 #1 overall picks have at some point played Major League Baseball. To an extent, it shows just how good the top-end talent winds up being. So this begs the obvious question: who were the 3 that never made it? And what happened there? We'll go in chronological order, and asking you nicely, do not Google who they are. I'll even give you the years just to show you how rare it is that a draft pick this high leaves the game without ever participating in a big league game. 1966, 1991, and 2014. So roughly once every 25 years. We start in 1966, with the second #1 overall pick in MLB history. The New York Mets were in their 5th year of existence here. Nothing at all, other than attendance somehow, was going right for them. This was until they struck gold and acquired the rights to Tom Seaver in a weird, one-of-a-kind lottery-type drawing. They knew he was going to be special, and by the time he was 24, was the best pitcher in baseball. Seaver is quite possibly the best right-handed pitcher of his era, and for a while the record holder for highest percentage of votes earned to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. He's obviously not who the Mets selected first overall in 1966 then. Every pitcher needs a catcher, and the Mets thought they had found Seaver his battery mate for the future. Steve Chilcott was a slugging left-handed hitting catcher out of Antelope Valley High School in LA County, California. More than one of his teammates said that Chilcott was the kid everyone wanted to be. Big, athletic kid for his time, dominant two-sport athlete, was scouted by Casey Stengel for the Mets, but not the #1 prize of this draft, even the day he was selected first overall. There was one other huge contender for top draft choice of 1966, a hitter from the college ranks who you'll be introduced to in a bit. Early in 1967, Chilcott was tearing up the minor leagues. He led his league in doubles and his team in almost every single hitting category they had. This was until July 23rd, when Chilcott was on first base in a minor league game. He broke for second on a ball in play, slid into second base, and thought he was out. So he got up off second base and started heading back to the dugout. He got like 5 feet off the bag before realizing he was safe the whole time. He awkwardly dives back to second base, the infielder both tags him out, and falls on Chilcott's throwing shoulder in the process. Chilcott would dislocate that shoulder, and never be the same afterwards. He struggled with throwing for the rest of his life. Over the next 3 years, he'd suffer 14 partial dislocations of that same shoulder, with the dam bursting on his health there after that first injury. Sports medicine wasn't advanced enough at the time to properly help him, and his body was just never able to do the job the same way. On the day Chilcott's career was ruined forever, the other candidate for #1 overall draft pick had 26 big league games under his belt already, making the big leagues just barely over a year after draft day. Chilcott and this other player would be separated by 563 big league home runs.
There's a long drive. That one is going way up. It is off the roof.
Reggie Jackson wanted to be a Met. He did in that moment. He wished he could have wound up there in hindsight. Another left-handed slugger, Jackson honed his craft at Arizona State before being considered the top amateur player in his class. The Mets were outright not interested, though. Not because of any lack of talent, but because he was in an interracial relationship, when he's also partially of that same race in his own ethnic background and makes the blatant prejudice all the more insane. Reggie has publicly said that his coach at ASU broke the news to him before the draft, and it stunned him. adding to the long and particularly heartbreaking list of racially motivated hatred he received in baseball and in life as he was trying to make a career for himself in pro ball. Jackson's A's would beat the Mets in the 1973 World Series, and he'd become a megastar across town for the Yankees in the 1970s. He is one of the greatest power hitters to have ever lived, and to this day, he wishes he could have been a part of the 1969 Mets, who, in spite of this terrible draft day whiff, still improbably won a World Series.
The Mets are the world champions.
Chilcott also wished he could have been a part of that, a little bit jealous of his friends from Mets minor league ball who got to be a part of that, while his shoulder was still an unmitigated disaster. Chilcott, unbelievably, hadn't had the last terribly unpredictable injury of his career to that point. He suffered a severe knee injury, falling on a sprinkler head while still with the Mets organization before being traded across town to the Yankees, where a foul ball would absolutely annihilate his bare hand. He left baseball altogether by the time he was 23 years old. When Reggie was 23, he was statistically 89% better than the average MLB hitter. Chilcott, however, made the best of his life after that. He worked as a firefighter, became a full-time contractor, and eventually got into real estate full-time. He said he very rarely thought about his minor league days much since retirement. Only in moments where that shoulder still hurt was when he would think about it. It's quite nice to know that Chilcott, at least on the surface, understood that he just drew a bad card in life, got unlucky with injuries and timing, and didn't appear to have resentment for Reggie Jackson becoming a superstar for the A's and maybe the most famous baseball player in the world when he was at his best for the Yankees. A complicated, sad story of the first #1 pick that never made it. And gets all the more strange when you know the second man on this list was just the second, and still most recent, #1 overall pick the New York Yankees themselves ever had. Coming from the North Carolina high school ranks, Brian Taylor was considered one of, if not the, greatest high school pitchers of all time when he entered the 1991 MLB draft. The favorite for the Yankees to pick, #1 overall. He was immediately compared to the Mets ace pitcher of this era, Dwight Gooden. The Mets brought Gooden up quickly, and he was the best pitcher in the world by the time he was 20. The Yankees' vision was that. Literally, have their own version of that. They even had Gooden meet Taylor within 2 years of drafting him. The GM who made the call to draft him would later compare him to Randy Johnson. His agent, Scott Boras, said 15 years after that draft that Taylor was still the best high school pitcher he'd ever seen. The Yankees' initial reward for taking him was a war of unprecedentedly high and outrageous asks from Boras and Taylor, accusations of racism, threats of having Brian go the JUCO baseball route and come back into the draft next year if the Yankees didn't meet his demands, and George Steinbrenner saying from a distance during his ban from baseball that if the Yankees failed to sign Taylor, quote, "If they let him go, they ought to be shot." Beautiful words of support from their ownership from afar. The Yankees felt the pressure to get their guy, and got a deal done, worth $1.55 million, which was a ton of money for a high schooler in those days. Before ever throwing a professional pitch, he was labeled as the #1 minor league prospect of them all, and later in minor league games, his performance was pretty good. But their plan to create their own Dwight Gooden hit some snags when they painfully realized he was nowhere near as ready for the show as Gooden was for the Mets. They noticed he had an extremely strong weakness for holding runners on base. So even if he made hitters look like me taking some hacks at the kiddie field that lives where the old College World Series Stadium in Omaha stands, if someone was to get on base, things could unravel quickly for him. They asked him to further develop after the minor league season in instructional league ball. He refused, citing being tired as his reasoning. Then, in December of 1993, there was a fight involving his brother and someone other than Brian. There are very mixed accounts over the years that have come out on how the fight started, but what we do know is that Brian eventually got involved. Brian later confronted the man who fought his brother, and the only thing that is indisputably true in this entire story is what happened next. Brian engaged in a fight with the dude who fought his brother, then fell on his left shoulder and dislocated it. Oh no, you have got to be kidding me. Why do all these #1 overall pick busts have freak preventable shoulder dislocation injuries? Are you serious? Dr. Frank Jobe, the inventor of Tommy John surgery, called Brian's shoulder injury from the fall one of the worst he'd ever seen. On top of the dislocation, his capsule and labrum were torn in his throwing shoulder. Jobe, for what it's worth, gave very encouraging comments after surgery for Brian's outlook. Based on what we know now, far too encouraging. Taylor did make it back to the mound, yes, but he was nowhere near the same. His fastball was 8 miles an hour slower, and he could not throw his curveball for a strike at all. In the words of Brian himself, "Sometimes I get the ball across the plate, sometimes I feel like I've never held a ball in my life." His control was totally gone, and by 1998, the Yankees cut ties with him. Right in the middle of forming their dynasty, full of homegrown legends and a couple inner circle Hall of Famers they developed, the most hyped prospect of all was never even close to being a part of it. Much like Chilcott with the '69 Mets, Taylor could only watch from afar as the Yankees climbed to the top of the mountain. After a second chance with Seattle and a third chance with Cleveland, he was done in baseball by 2001. He quietly moved back to North Carolina in retirement, and from the outside looking in the first handful of years after he was done with the game, he started up a simple, ordinary life for himself. That is, until his name re-entered the news in 2012, for when he was facing up to 40 years in jail when he was federally indicted for cocaine trafficking. A crime he would serve time in prison for. A sad, devastating final note we have to the story of the most hyped pitching prospect the New York Yankees have ever had. We can only wonder what could have been if cooler heads had prevailed during the offseason of 1993 and his left shoulder remained intact.
If you feel that you wasn't there because you didn't have the talent, but if you feel that you were good enough and you had an injury that slows you down, that's some relief now. A part of you always wants to get there some kind of way. I mean, it happened. I didn't want it to happen. Nobody wanted it to happen. But it happened. And you can either not accept it and beat yourself to death, or you can go on with life. And I mean, you're not going to play forever anyway.
23 years later, we saw maybe the next highest regarded high school lefty since Taylor. His name was Brady Aiken. MLB.com and Keith Law each had him as the top prospect in the draft. Perfect Games report on him loved him, and the Houston Astros GM that held the #1 pick for the draft said of him, quote, "He has command like I've never seen before of his stuff." Oh, is that not good enough for you? Well, he also separately called Aiken the most advanced high school pitcher I've ever seen in my entire career. He was the third high school pitcher to go #1 in the draft when the Astros picked him in 2014. And eerily enough, the first since Brian Taylor in 1991.
It was kind of a surprise, but, it's something that I wanted, something that I worked hard for, and something that I feel like I deserved. And just the moment that it happened, it was so crazy, and it's unbelievable.
At first, everything was going just fine. Both sides were excited, and a signing bonus of $6.5 million was agreed to by the two parties. The next step in the process, just to make sure everything was clean, a physical. They used the word abnormality to describe what was found in Aiken's elbow, his throwing elbow at that. The Astros felt like they had grounds to significantly slash his offer. They did this for two reasons. One, they were now going to be taking a huge risk investing in a guy whose arm wasn't looking like it was going to be able to do the job long term. Even if he was asymptomatic and wasn't hurt yet, they were genuinely freaked out by what they saw. Two, if a team fails to sign a first-round draft pick, they're compensated by getting that pick slot +1 in the next draft. So if Houston fails to sign Aiken, who they used the first pick on, they get the second pick next year. Aiken and his camp, obviously, weren't having this. The Astros cut $4 million off their offer on the signing bonus Aiken would receive. Then came weeks of radio silence on another offer after that was turned down, before they eventually came back up to $5 million. Aiken declined, and the deal was dead. It became a massive controversy, and the Astros were ripped apart by the Players Association and the media for their role in this. Although, Aiken was still reasonably criticized for not just taking $5 million, and in the years since, we have seen similar things go down, most notably the Mets and Kumar Rocker. The Mets really do come up a lot in this story, do they? The Astros weren't punished in any way other than their ability to sign other draft picks being hurt, since each team gets a cumulative pool of money to allocate between all of their picks. The situation with Aiken proved to be a major complication for other players, and Aiken's high school teammate and roommate at IMG Academy in Florida / Astros 5th round draft pick Jacob Nix couldn't get a deal done with Houston either in the fallout from this nuclear bomb of negotiations, and the consequences the organization would have in the short term. Such a small world. You and your roommate both got agreed upon signing bonus numbers cut from you by the same team because they needed to protect their own necks from regulation punishment, and you both told that team to just get lost. Only one thing was for certain though. The deadline for draft picks to sign a contract with their teams had passed. Aiken and the Astros had never gotten a deal done. Aiken's plan was to re-enter the draft in 2015 and try again, basically what Taylor threatened to do to the Yankees. But his outlook significantly changed in March of 2015, when he had Tommy John surgery to repair his left elbow after tearing his ulnar collateral ligament, giving a huge degree of credibility to the Astros' concerns from the summer before. For what it's worth, the player they used that compensation pick on in 2015, he's won 2 World Series so far with Houston, and nearly stole an MVP from Mike freaking Trout in 2019. All three of these picks had their teams eventually win World Series titles within 5 years of these drafts with dominant, homegrown cores, and none of them had anything to do with that success. Such a draft oddity, and such a major bullet each organization was able to dodge on their poor draft day luck. Cleveland took a chance on Aiken's 17th overall in 2015, and were able to sign him to a contract. His signing bonus? $2.5 million. He made his professional debut in their organization roughly a year later, and experienced mixed results in his first pro season. Year 2 was healthier, but shakier on the field for Aiken. So he didn't pitch in a single minor league game in year 3, instead staying at Cleveland's instructional facilities to improve everything else. Mechanics, fundamentals, confidence, you name it. He appeared in 2 minor league games in 2019, and was in no way able to properly compete in them. By the end of 2019, he would be labeled the team's biggest mystery, and those 2 minor league games of that year would be the last games Aiken would ever pitch. We don't really know what happened next with Aiken, much less have a clear, straightforward timeline of events with what went down. What we do know is this: there was no minor league season in 2020 thanks to the global pandemic. Aiken suffered from thoracic outlet syndrome, which is one of the most devastating things that can happen to a pitcher's body, and totally cripples their shoulder. He stepped away from baseball for a bit in 2019, expressed some interest in coming back before COVID took that possibility away. The team wasn't sure he was really ever going to return. As early as the fall of 2019, he supposedly never made it back to team activity in 2021, despite technically still being a member of the organization, and then was cut after that season. That was it. Brady Aiken was out of baseball by the time he was 25. In his final 4 years in the Cleveland organization, he recorded just 2 minor league outs in official games. I personally find Aiken's story the most heartbreaking of the 3. I'm sure the experience of his contract negotiations with Houston took a heavy toll on him, and his physical and mental health both failing him in Cleveland had to be a level of darkness that's difficult to really understand or describe. We've never really heard from him since. We've barely ever gotten his account of things. Even if Brady's dad cited seeing great treatment of his son by the Cleveland organization, and seeing his son as happy as ever, there's no way this is an experience Brady is going to look back 100% fondly on. The pitcher he was on draft day 2014 and the pitcher he was in Pro Ball were way different. He struggled to regain velocity after his Tommy John surgery, and he struggled even worse with having either that great command or great stuff. And the worst part is, we have no reason to believe any of this was his fault. I just wish someday we can hear from him again, and find out if he made it out okay. Unbelievably, all 3 of these guys had the same kind of injury wind up being the nail in the coffin for their careers. Irreversible damage to their throwing shoulders. Chilcott on a freak tag play where a fielder fell on him, Taylor himself falling in an off-season fight, and Aiken developing thoracic outlet syndrome. Even if Aiken was in serious trouble before that, TOS tends to be a death blow to a pitcher. And none of the 3 were able to be a part of championships for the team that picked them first overall. Each team winding up coming out of the failure of losing out on their top draft choice unscathed. Baseball is not a fair game. Life isn't either. These 3 guys took radically different paths to get to become the top draft choice. Then all took radically different paths when their baseball careers suffered cruel, devastating fates. All 3 are cautionary tales, and all 3 are proof that not all busts are made equal, or what they seem. The only thing I'd bet we can all agree on across the board, you wouldn't wish what happened to these guys on anybody.